For 70 years, if you wanted a one-word answer for what a stable, competitive, reliable economy looked like, the answer was Germany. Precision engineering, disciplined finances, the export machine that powered half of Europe. That version of Germany is gone. In 2026, Germany is on track for its fourth recession in 4 years, an outcome with no precedent in the country's post-war history. Not a downturn, not a rough patch. 4 years in a row where Europe's largest economy either shrank or barely avoided shrinking. Industrial production sits roughly 15% below where it stood back in 2017. And this did not happen to Germany. Germany, in large part, did this to itself. This video is not about a country hit by bad luck. It is about a very specific set of decisions made over 2 decades that all quietly pointed in the same direction. And that direction turned out to be a dead end. Cheap energy that vanished overnight. A car industry that bet its future on an engine the world stopped wanting. A government that saved money for a rainy day and then refused to spend it, even once the rain started. Volkswagen is cutting 35,000 jobs. Bosch is eliminating 22,000 positions. ThyssenKrupp, once the literal symbol of German industrial strength, is cutting 11,000 steel jobs to competitors that did not exist a generation ago. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how the most disciplined economy in Europe became its most fragile one, and why throwing €500 billion at the problem might not be enough to fix it. For 2 decades, Germany ran on a formula that seemed almost too good to be true. Buy enormous quantities of cheap natural gas from Russia through pipelines built specifically for that purpose. Use that cheap energy to power the most energy-intensive manufacturing sector in Europe, and sell the finished cars, machinery and chemicals back to the entire world at a profit. Germany essentially outsourced its energy security to a single supplier, betting that the economics was simply too good for either side to ever walk away from. That bet ended the moment Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, when Germany lost access to the cheap gas that its entire industrial model had been quietly built around. Energy costs for German industry spiked almost overnight, and they have never fully returned to where they were. While the energy story was unfolding, a second, slower bet was quietly failing at the same time. German automakers spent decades perfecting the internal combustion engine, becoming the undisputed global leader in a technology that took a century to master. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary competitive advantage. Then the world's largest car market decided the future was electric, almost overnight, and that market was China. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, unencumbered by a century of combustion engine expertise, moved faster, and Germany's car makers found themselves defending a technology the market was actively abandoning. The skill that had defined German industrial identity for 100 years became, almost overnight, the wrong skill to have. Here is what makes Germany's situation genuinely unusual compared to a normal economic downturn. The economy contracted 0.9% in 2023, contracted again 0.5% in 2024, managed only 0.2% growth in 2025, and the government's own forecast for 2026 has already been cut to somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6%. 4 consecutive years without a real recovery. Economists who study Germany for a living have started using a phrase that would have been unthinkable a decade ago: permanent crisis mode. This is not a country waiting out a storm. It is a country whose growth engine has been idling for half a decade, with no clear sign of when or if it restarts. Numbers on a page do not capture what this actually looks like inside the companies that built modern Germany's reputation. Industrial production is running roughly 15% below its 2017 peak, and factory capacity utilization has fallen to around 78%, meaning more than a fifth of German industrial capacity now sits idle. Volkswagen, the company whose name is practically synonymous with German manufacturing, announced plans to cut 35,000 jobs and close plants on German soil for the first time in its history. Bosch is eliminating 22,000 positions. This is not one struggling company. It is the entire industrial core of the country contracting at the same time. Whenever a major economy stagnates for years, the automatic comparison people reach for is Japan's lost decades, and Germany gets compared to that story constantly. But the parallel does not actually hold up. Japan's stagnation followed an asset price bubble bursting and was accompanied by persistent deflation. Germany's crisis is not a bubble bursting, it is a structural shift in the global energy and trade landscape that made its dominant industries less competitive almost overnight. A closer historical parallel might be Britain after 1979, when a manufacturing-heavy economy had to violently reinvent itself at enormous social cost, because the industries it had built its identity around simply stopped being competitive in a changed world. And in 2026, a third pressure joined the first two, arriving from an unexpected direction. The United States raised import tariffs on European vehicles from 15 to 25%, and Germany, which sends a larger share of its auto exports to America than any other EU country, absorbs the largest share of that damage. Machinery and chemicals, two other pillars of the German export economy, are not directly targeted by these tariffs, but face the same weaker demand and reduced investment indirectly as the whole trading system around them grows more uncertain. Three separate shocks arriving in sequence over 4 years, each one hitting an economy that was already weaker than the last time it got hit. For years, Germany's response to warning signs was to do almost nothing, protected by a constitutional rule that strictly limited how much debt the government could take on, a rule Germany itself had insisted on writing after previous crises. In 2025, facing a fourth year of stagnation, the government finally changed course. Germany reformed its constitutional debt limit and approved a €500 billion infrastructure fund, one of the largest fiscal commitments in the country's post-war history. For a country famous for decades of budget discipline, this was a genuine reversal, an admission that the old rulebook no longer fit the emergency it was facing. But the honest problem with this plan is that €500 billion is a fiscal answer to what is fundamentally a competitiveness problem, and those are not the same thing. The German Federation of Industries has stated plainly that Germany's weakness is structural: high labour costs, high taxes, heavy bureaucracy, and elevated energy prices that have eroded competitiveness in ways that new roads and bridges cannot directly fix. You can build all the infrastructure you want, but if it still costs more to manufacture a car in Germany than in China, and the tariffs and energy prices that created that gap have not gone away, the money buys time without necessarily buying a solution. Germany is not just any economy struggling, it is the largest economy in the European Union, and for decades it functioned as the growth engine that pulled smaller neighbours along with it through supply chains, trade and investment. The European Central Bank has explicitly warned that a prolonged conflict and continued German weakness could push both Germany and Italy into a technical recession by the end of 2026. When Germany's factories run at 4/5 capacity, the parts suppliers in Poland, the steel producers in the Czech Republic, and the logistics companies across the entire continent all feel it too. This is not a story contained inside one country's borders. The lesson underneath Germany's collapse is not really about Germany specifically. It is about what happens when an economy builds its entire identity around being extraordinarily good at exactly one thing: cheap energy from one supplier, one type of engine, one dominant export market. Each individual bet looked rational at the time it was made, sometimes for decades. But concentration that looks like strength during good years becomes fragility the moment the world changes, and Germany bet heavily on a version of the world that no longer exists. Whether the €500 billion gamble is enough to build a new version of German competitiveness, or whether it simply delays a harder reckoning, is a question nobody, including the people spending that money, can honestly answer yet. Germany did not stumble into this crisis. It walked into it deliberately, one reasonable decision at a time, over 20 years, until 3 of those decisions all failed at once. The country that once defined what a stable, disciplined, world-class economy looked like is now running its factories at 4/5 capacity, cutting tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs and betting €500 billion that it can reinvent itself before the next shock arrives. The most honest thing you can say about Germany right now is that nobody knows yet whether this is a nation in the middle of a painful but temporary transition, or a nation that has permanently lost the formula that made it Europe's engine for 70 years. If you want to understand the forces reshaping the world's largest economies, subscribe to Mainnet Codex. See you in the next one.